My name is Paula Gilbert, and I am joined by Anurupa Roy. And
Hello, everyone.
We are local government specialists at the Department of State in the Division of Local Government Services. We are also joined by Patricia Burke, who will be answering some of the questions that you have in the chat box. So this afternoon, our course is affordable housing, and we're going to talk about what that means, some of the tools that you can use in your community to encourage affordable housing. We're going to look at why it's such an issue across New York State. We're going to look at some case law, etc. But before we get started, I just want to go over the rules of the road. So you should hear me speaking by now. If not, you'll want to check your audio settings in the drop-down at the top of your program window. If it's still not working, you might want to log out and log back in, but try not to do it too many times. You can also have the system call you for audio if you're still having difficulty with the audio. We are not IT professionals, and we're all working from home right now, so unfortunately we cannot assist with technical issues on your end. To ask some questions, please use the chat feature and choose host, panelists, and presenters, which is the fourth option down in the chat box. We will try to answer as many questions as time permits. If we cannot, you can always email us for technical assistance at localgov@dos.ny.gov. And that's for any issues that you're any issues that pop up in your service as board members. We are always here to help. And certificates will be emailed to participants in a couple of days or probably next week, because we send the reports to the county planners and they take care of it, or the staff at Southern Tier West. So give them a couple of days. We ask for patience. And just a word of warning, WebEx is watching. Those who log in late or leave early may only receive partial credit. In fact, it even can tell if you're minimizing your window and not paying attention. So just beware of that. And with that, we're going to get started because we have a lot to go over this afternoon. So essentially, we will go over what affordable housing is, some of the basics and how we calculate it. We're going to look at the history over time, as well as the issue of homelessness. We're going to look at exclusionary housing practices, as well as some of the case law that has come out of that. We're going to look at affordable housing laws, policies, and programs, some land use tools that you can use in your municipalities to encourage it, the development process, and preservation. We're also going to touch briefly on the impact of COVID-19 on housing as well. And I really love this quote from Matthew Desmond from his book, Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City. And that is, decent affordable housing should be a basic right for everybody in this country. The reason is simple. Without stable shelter, everything else falls apart. And I think that's absolutely true, especially in my work in affordable housing before I joined the Department of State. It's true, kids do a lot better in school if they live in decent quality affordable housing. It brings down healthcare costs. We'll talk all about that later on. And now I am going to turn it over to Anurupa to get us started.
Hi, everyone. Can I have the control of the screen?
Yeah, we need David to pass it off.
Yeah.
Hopefully everybody has seen the slides change over the last couple of slides.
I couldn't see the change, though.
Oh, so that means most likely everybody has it.
Mm-hmm.
David. David. Oh, he's frozen. Uh-oh.
Oh.
Oh, we're off to a good start here this afternoon. We'll give him a minute to fix that. Sorry, everyone.
Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, here I see I'm the presenter now. Thank you, David. All right, I'll just move the slides.
again, we talked about those, and now Anurupa is going to talk to us about the basics. Sorry that we totally missed all of that.
All right, so as Paula mentioned, that housing is something very important to everyone, and it's a basic human right, and if that is not in place, then everything falls apart. That's so true. So as we all know, this is something that we are all familiar with. So one of the basic necessities of life is safe shelter or housing. But unfortunately, that is not what everyone has or is guaranteed for. And in this regard, affordability can largely determine if one has proper housing or not. So in this section and the following sections as well, we'll be discussing a few relevant terms and issues related to affordable housing, such as the importance of affordable housing and the associated benefits and challenges. So what is affordable housing? Now, we are all kind of familiar with this term. So there's a technical definition, though, by the US Department of Housing and Urban Development. It generally refers to, for housing to be affordable, the cost should not exceed 30% of the household gross annual income, which includes utilities. So if housing costs such as mortgage payment and taxes and insurance or rent exceed 30%, it is considered a cost burden. So households facing this burden are challenged to afford food, clothing, transportation, childcare, education, medical costs, and other needs. So if someone is paying more than 30% of his or her annual or gross income, then chances are high he or she would be compromising on other fronts which are necessary for a proper living condition and lifestyle. But many may think that affordable housing units are like failed public housing projects of the past, but that is a myth. Any house or apartment can be affordable depending on the market and household income. However, there are specific tools that are used to develop and maintain affordability in expensive or high property value markets. Therefore, affordable housing units comes in all shapes and sizes. As the slide here shows, the top picture is for the senior housing in West Sand Lake, and the bottom picture is from Troy. So these are both one is a high-rise and one is not a high-rise. You can see it's very different in shape, but both are for senior living, and both are in that way affordable housing or kind of contribute toward affordable housing units. So it is not that whenever we think of affordable housing, it has to be of certain size and shape. That's not true. Throughout our presentation here, we'll be emphasizing the need for affordable housing as it is necessary and desirable for many working class families, especially in areas where housing is in short supply or are beyond the means of average middle class families and low income families. A range of choices for them with different household incomes and varied household types can go a long way in stabilizing the economy, which we will be going into more detail as we move along. So this table or chart kind of amply proves that the need for affordable housing in economic terms is quite pressing. So please note that affordable housing is not just a downstate problem, which may be a popular perception, but even in the upstate, it is a critical issue. So as the table here mentions, that the working at a minimum wage each week, which is a little over $11 per hour, a person in New York State would have to work 95 hours to afford a modest one-bedroom apartment at the fair market rent. So you can barely imagine it's virtually impossible, or rather extremely difficult, to afford a modest one-bedroom apartment in the New York State. Paula here will go into more detail about the regional, how the region of a southern tier looks like, west looks like.
Great. So we often get skeptical looks when we discuss New York State's fair market rent figures, especially in our more rural areas, because overall about 50% of New Yorkers rent, but in our rural communities, we don't see that as much. In fact, sometimes it's even harder to rent in rural communities due to a lack of supply and cost. So we've looked at your 3 primary counties to give you a more local perspective. 25% of households rent in Allegheny County, 29% in Cattaraugus County, and 30% in Chautauqua County. A studio in your region roughly costs about $540, a 1-bedroom about $585, a 2-bedroom about $718, and a 3-bedroom $930, though steeper in Cattaraugus at $993. And finally, $1,100-ish for a 4-bedroom. Then we look at median household income for renters in your region: $25,769 in Allegheny, $26,428 in Cattaraugus, and $23,981 in Chautauqua. For comparison, the median household income in New York State is $65,323. So we're talking about incomes that are roughly $40,000 below the state average. Locally, your median local household incomes are $43,033 in Allegheny, $47,240 in Cattaraugus County, and $45,332 in Chautauqua County. So renters are making roughly $20,000 less on average compared to others in your community. When we look at income needed to afford apartments at fair market rent in your region, it's not so bad for studios or 1-bedroom apartments, but as soon as you get to 2 bedrooms, the median renter income in all counties is less than the income needed to afford those places without being cost burdened. This makes it difficult to house renters with families that need more space, or they end up crammed in smaller places. As a result, 42% of renters in Allegheny, 40% of renters in Cattaraugus, and 45% of renters in Chautauqua County are paying more than 35% of their income on rent, which is considered a severe housing cost burden. For owners, the situation isn't as dire. 75% of households in Allegheny own their homes, whereas 71% in Cattaraugus and 70% in Chautauqua. Median home values are a little lower in Allegheny at $73,900 and about $86,000 in Cattaraugus and Chautauqua counties. Median household income for owners in all 3 counties are higher than the statewide average of $65,323. Median owner costs are about $1,000 per month, which is lower than that fair market rent for the 4-bedroom rental in your community. But you still have more than a quarter of owners in all 3 counties spending more than 35% of their income on housing. So while the situation is better for homeowners overall, you still have some owners struggling to keep up, and that's probably more apparent now in the time of COVID-19, which we'll also discuss later in this presentation. In affordable housing, one of the most commonly used terms is known as area median income, what we call AMI. It is a calculation done annually on the federal level to determine income eligibility for a variety of housing programs. Median family income figures are used and then adjusted for different family sizes. All those earning less than 80% of area median income are considered lower income. People with lower incomes make up 40% of the nation's total population. Low income is considered for those making between 50 and 80% AMI. And very low income is those households making less than 50% of AMI, and extremely low income are those families earning less than 30% of AMI. This population, the extremely low income, is the hardest population to house, and probably even more so in your rural community. To illustrate the concept of AMI, here we have an example where AMI is calculated at $60,000. You can see for a family of 2 earning less than $55,000 would qualify for assistance at 80% of area median income or less. A family of 4 earning less than $42,950 is considered very low income at 50% AMI, and a family of 3 earning less than $23,200 is considered extremely low income at 30% AMI. Again, these calculations are available on the HUD website and are updated annually. Staying housed is a serious struggle for many Americans. There are not enough subsidized units for those who need it, whether they are homeless, ill-housed, or cost-burdened. Millions of people live in very difficult housing situations, including doubling up, paying more than 50% of their income on housing, or living in overcrowded or substandard housing. The number of people at risk for losing their housing is greater than the number homeless on any given day in the United States. The U.S. Census stopped measuring housing conditions in 1960, but HUD now sponsors surveys done by the Census Bureau called the American Housing Survey. It has found that 4.9% of the nation's housing is physically deficient, with the worst deficiencies lacking basic plumbing and heating, cracks in walls, ceilings, and floors, and the presence of vermin, which causes spikes in childhood asthma rates and increased health care for everyone. In fact, we spend over $2 billion a year on asthma annually that can be contributed to poor indoor air quality. If a building gets to the point where it must be demolished, those units of housing aren't usually replaced, meaning we have more people competing for less units. That's where we see many families overcrowding into smaller spaces and paying more for it. As we saw in the table before, more than 50% of renters in New York are cost-burdened, which means they're paying more for housing, leaving less for food and other essentials. It also showed us the cost burden is a problem in both urban and rural areas. So it's not just a problem downstate as it is upstate. And who benefits from affordable housing? The benefits of integrating affordable housing into your community is endless, especially when we look at populations that may need help, including seniors, young adults, single-parent families, veterans, and maybe your friends and family, and potentially really anyone. I always get looks of shock when I tell people that in 2015, which was only 5 years ago, that 1 in every 20 homes in New York State was in foreclosure. This crisis isn't just for renters, and homeowners are not immune. When people feel secure in their housing, children do better in school, and employees are more productive at work, and they don't have to travel long distance to get to work. There are many places in New York State that have long commutes, or there's many people in New York State that have long commutes because they cannot afford to live in the communities they serve. In fact, they can't hire police officers in Lake Placid because they can't afford to live in the municipality and there's a residency restriction. So in some regions, there are significant problems for blue and white collar workers securing housing. It's not just a low income problem. So there are many challenges to building and developing affordable housing. The cost of building new units is high based on the cost of land, labor, etc. Regulation of housing construction can drive up those costs. Land use regulation can act as barriers to entry. Extended time is the enemy because time is money, and affordable housing normally takes a long time relative to other types of development projects. It can also be challenged in courts, which adds additional time and cost to these developments. Filtering down of older units. If new houses are out of reach for the poor, in theory, their needs could be met by the filtering down of older units at lower costs, because older houses generally cost less than new houses. But in reality, units do not filter down either as quickly or as sharply as would be needed to reach low-income families at prices they can afford. For leadership changes, leadership obviously can change with every election, and funding and support for those programs can disappear overnight. In fact, because of the economic crisis we're in, we're seeing a lot of that money disappear from both the federal side and the state side. For consumer patterns and beliefs, there's a lot of unfortunate widespread opposition, which can delay or stop affordable housing from being developed in your communities. We will also talk about exclusionary housing practices in the later slide, but essentially the conclusion of the slide is this. Affordable housing needs are not adequately addressed in the marketplace, so we all need to do our part to try to encourage it. And I'm going to pass it back over to Anurupa to talk about some of the history.
Thank you, Paula. To have a better understanding of affordable housing, its necessity, and the measures that can be taken to ensure that, it is good to have a bit of a background of the general housing conditions for the public and the policies and programs adopted by the government. Also, how the concept has evolved over the years can also provide valuable lessons for our future. So it's good to have a little bit of historical background of how affordable housing has evolved over the years. Also, the history of affordable housing, or housing for that matter, is acutely connected with racial disparities and social equity issues. Our presentation today does not directly focus on that, but it's important to note that the history and geography of housing development in this country are deeply connected with the racial question. We can have probably a semester-long course on the subject of affordable housing history. Of course, that is not possible here, as also this is not our main goal. So I will just briefly go over the important historical landmarks and processes which have shaped the affordable housing history as we see it today. So housing as an issue was largely missing from the policy arena until the mid to late 1800s. Around 1850, there was a huge surge of jobs due to the advancement in the manufacturing sector, which attracted workers from different parts. They came to the cities in search of work, and most often were housed in tenements with poor living conditions, such as very crowded spaces, safety concerns, lack of ventilation, proper ventilation, and so on. So basically, the tenements were not conducive to living. And the response to the high demand in housing was private and profitable without much intervention from the government side. In 1901, the New York State Tenement House Act was sanctioned. Now, this was one of the reforms of the progressive era and also one of the first such laws to ban the construction of dark, poorly ventilated tenement buildings in the state of New York. Among other sanctions, the law also required the new buildings must have outward-facing windows, proper ventilation systems, indoor toilets, and also fire safeguards. This New York State Tenement House Act was the basis of similar legislation in America for a long time. The idea of government subsidies or direct involvement in creation of subsidized or public housing was still a little far-fetched at this point. But in 1930s, just after the Great Depression under President Roosevelt's administration, the New Deal was launched, which was a series of domestic economic programs to give a boost to the economy so that it can recover from the adverse effects of the Depression. This was a landmark moment in the history of affordable housing because that is when the government directly engaged in providing housing solutions in order to uplift the middle classes. Although it should be noted that it was mainly geared toward the white middle class population. The new U.S. Housing Authority Act of 1937 also introduced rent subsidies for the first time. So overall, during this time, public housing projects were undertaken or were just started to being undertaken, and they started increasing in numbers. The 1950s and 60s witnessed a number of social and geographical changes, such as the movement of the white population in the suburban areas, which is more commonly called the white flight. This was largely facilitated by the government, which encouraged home ownership of the white middle-class population in the suburban areas in the form of single-family homes, mostly, by providing subsidies and loan assistance. So the government was proactively engaged in providing assistance and subsidies, and that encouraged or kind of boosted the movement of white population from the cities to the suburban areas. This was happening at the same time when urban renewal in the inner city parts and highway construction were also taking place. So unfortunately, this led to the mass displacement of many low-income families, which were mainly the disadvantaged racial groups. Many of them found shelter in subsidized apartment buildings, also referred to more commonly as the projects, which had predominantly non-white population. And these new rules for the housing project, there were new rules for these housing projects. Residents had to vacate if the income increased, and they were also accepting very poorer households in these housing projects. So this just shows some of the pictures of the housing projects here in their history, the changing times. If you look at the various programs here, you will see that in the 1960s to 1980s, the federal government was directly involved in some ways in creating public housing in cooperation with the local and state governments. But as we entered 1980s, especially with the Reagan administration, there was a gradual shift toward contracting out affordable housing services, increasingly to the private sector, including construction, rehabilitation, and management. Since the 2007 and 2008 financial crisis, there has also been an implementation of more conservative lending practices. One of the things that can be said is during the Bush administration in 2000, there was an increasing home ownership. So the number of homeowners in the US reached 73.4 million, and that was the most ever. And for the first time, the majority of minority Americans owned their own homes during this period. And also during the Obama's administration from 2009 to 2015, around that time, there were many programs, among them like Home Affordable Modification Program and the Home Affordable Refinance Program were launched. So these were launched mainly to address refinancing and modification of loans that are guaranteed by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. The goal was to assist people affected by the housing crisis of the recent recession. So these programs were accessed by over 3.4 million homeowners. This chart shows the total number of public housing units that were constructed during a 50-year period. You see there is a downward trend since 1980s. The point is, even though the need has not gone down, as we have seen at the beginning of our presentation, there is a reduction in the new affordable housing units, which is concerning. Homelessness is both a cause of the higher need of more affordable housing units and also the effect of the lack of affordable housing. So is it a new problem or just a current issue? No, it is not, but the degree of the problem has kind of intensified in the past few decades. Although some amount of homelessness existed since the colonial times, it started growing since the Great Depression. But since the 1970s and 80s, homelessness has particularly increased. Across the United States, more than 500,000 people were homeless on a single night in 2018, of which a striking 17% Americans were in New York State, which is about 92,000. So what are the causes? Why do we have this problem, especially since 1970s? How has this kind of intensified? So there are various reasons contributing towards this issue or the problem. Higher housing cost burdens, as we have seen, like the cost burdens is a major reason for which people are unable to afford even like a one-bedroom house or a one-bedroom apartment in New York State. Along with that, there was eroding assistance to the supply of affordable housing units with the depletion of other social security programs, which greatly contributed to a rise in homelessness. Other reasons are a rising housing cost, along with that little or no increase in the real wages. So that's the wages adjusted for inflation. Urban renewal has been mentioned earlier as well as still continuing and resulting in gentrification and displacement, both direct and indirect displacement. Then deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill kind of took away the assistance that was provided to the mentally ill or the people with mental issues, and that affected or that resulted in a lot of people losing a place for living. Also, mental health issues such as post-traumatic stress disorder of many war veterans led to homelessness. Then another important reason could be or is a weakening of family ties in modern American family. And also substance abuse and drug and alcohol abuse have also resulted in homelessness. Now, there are some strategies that they were adopted. Even though it's an issue which local governments have to deal with, it is not one that is usually addressed by local governments. Some ways to manage the issue has been the creation of emergency shelters. Now, the Housing and Urban Development HUD estimates about 217,000 plus emergency shelter beds in US in 2005. There's also the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act of 1987, which is a federal law that provides federal money for homeless shelter programs. Then there is a transitional housing, which is fundamentally a social service delivery program, which requires no more than 2-year stay that is only permitted, and is a platform for providing some stabilization or housing readiness before the homeless kind of move out from the homeless shelters. There was also the Housing First model, which aims at providing rehabilitation and solution for homelessness through also through interfaith partnerships. Paula will discuss more on the exclusionary housing practices.
Great. So exclusionary zoning is zoning that excludes persons of low or moderate income from the community. Early planning effects were grounded on the belief that the public interest would be best served by the exclusion of undesirable land uses. Usually these are commercial and industrial uses from residential areas, but by the early 1900s, newly adopted land use zoning controls expanded on the exclusionary nature of community planning by not only physically separating the industrial, commercial, and residential zones, but also by distinguishing between single-family and multifamily residential zones. This essentially had the effect of excluding many middle to low-income persons, primarily renters, from increasingly large swaths of land which were being designated as single-family districts. With multifamily zones limited to already built up and often deteriorated older neighborhoods in the city core, the less well-to-do were locked into the city core. A number of communities took that income-based zoning even further by totally excluding all but single-family homes or by prohibiting manufactured housing units. By the 1970s, state courts across the nation held such actions to be unconstitutional, but we'll talk more about some of the cases in a couple slides. So suburban exclusion of affordable housing is real and commonplace, even in states with strong fair housing statutes and areas with strong local laws. So what do we mean by that? What are some examples of this? In New Jersey in the 1960s, many municipalities would use the 80-20 rule. At least 80% of apartments could contain one bedroom, and no more than 20% of those apartments could contain two bedrooms, and 3 or more bedroom apartments were not allowed, essentially blocking larger families from renting. We also had minimum lot size requirements that can be exclusionary. So land can be very expensive, so requiring large lot sizes for homes can essentially have an exclusionary nature. So you'll see where, one house has to have at least an acre of land or more in some communities. Some municipalities also prohibited multifamily housing outright, or multifamily housing would be subjected to an additional level of discretionary approval by the municipal governing board instead of the land use boards, or maybe they impose more conditions like allowing condos but not rentals. Overall, studies have shown that the impact of affordable housing on nearby property values, and they've found that there is very little evidence that affordable housing negatively impacts neighboring property values, which is often what happens when people come out to express their opposition to this type of housing. And now we're going to take a look at some of the important laws and cases, starting with federal law. So the U.S. Constitution bars discrimination based on race, but discrimination based on economic status is not considered. The Fair Housing Act was enacted or passed in 1968 and amended in 1988, and it prohibits discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, and disability. Zoning to prevent racially integrated subsidized housing can be a violation of the Fair Housing Act. And federal courts have held that the context of racially segregated housing patterns, municipal use of zoning to prevent construction of racially integrated subsidized housing may constitute a violation of the Fair Housing Act because of its racially discriminatory effect, even without overt evidence of its discriminatory intent. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of slides. So now looking at some court challenges, we start with Euclid versus Ambler. It's the landmark zoning case to be decided on by the Supreme Court in 1926. At the time, zoning was a new concept, and the court found that zoning was a reasonable use of the local government's police power to protect the health, safety, and general welfare of its community. So this Euclid case upheld the validity of zoning ordinances generally and specifically held that a municipality could exclude apartment buildings from residential zones to protect the residential character of the neighborhood and its desirability as a place of detached homes. That zoning would and could be used as a vehicle for social exclusion was recognized early by a trial judge in the Euclid case who wrote, "The effect to be accomplished is to classify the population and segregate them according to their income or situation in life." So we got zoning, but it also opened the door for exclusionary housing practices. We would continue with Euclid until the Mount Laurel cases in 1975 and 1983. In Mount Laurel 1, the plaintiffs challenged the town zoning ordinance, which only allowed single-family detached residences on medium to large lots as excluding the opportunity to establish affordable housing for low and moderate income people. The New Jersey Supreme Court questioned if the zoning promoted general welfare and if general welfare included the provision for adequate housing. The court concluded every municipality must, by its land use regulations, make possible an appropriate variety and choice of housing and cannot exclude the opportunity for low and moderate housing. 8 years later, in 1983, the court reconsidered the case in Mount Laurel 2 and forcefully responded to what it perceived as the town's failure to rezone to meet the demand for low and moderate income housing. The court assigned 3 judges to make fair share allocations for a number of units required to be constructed and included the builder's remedy. If a municipality failed to plan for affordable housing, lower courts could overturn the denials and grant the builder's remedy anyway. And during the same year as Mount Laurel 1, the New York Court of Appeals took a different approach in Berenson versus the town of Newcastle. In Newcastle, their zoning excluded any multifamily housing. Remember, your zoning must be based on your comprehensive plan. The Court of Appeals began a 2-part test used to determine whether a comprehensive plan meets your housing needs. The first part tests if a properly balanced and well-ordered plan had been provided, and the second part requires that comprehensive plans give consideration to regional housing needs and requirements. Since Newcastle is in Westchester and a pretty wealthy area, there is a need for multifamily housing throughout the county, and they cannot ignore it. So when you adopt a comprehensive plan, a municipality must consider the need for multifamily housing both within its community and in neighboring communities throughout the region. So that was in Westchester, but it means that because it was New York state law, every community has to consider it. And these are the major exclusionary zoning cases in New York State. I could go through all of them, but in the interest of time, I'll touch on one which I like the most, is the Continental Building case in 1995 on the right. In that case, in 1981, the town of North Salem, so again in Westchester County, their existing zoning was declared unconstitutional because it did not permit any multifamily housing as a matter of right in the town. As a result of the 1981 decision, the town rezoned 6 parcels of land in North Salem to permit multifamily housing as a matter of right. One of those parcels was rezoned for affordable housing, was owned by the Continental Building Company, which owned about 63 acres of land adjacent to a lake in the town of North Salem. However, in March 1987, so 6 years later, the North Salem Town Board enacted a new zoning ordinance which rezoned 5 of the 6 parcels to eliminate multifamily housing. Among the 5 parcels was Continental's property, which was rezoned to an R2 low-density zoning district. In a unanimous decision, the appellate division affirms that North Salem's zoning ordinance was unconstitutional on the grounds that it precluded construction of affordable housing to meet town and regional needs. It was the first time the court linked the Berenson's obligation to provide multifamily housing with the obligation that such housing be affordable housing. So now it is a requirement. Municipalities must give a reasonable opportunity to build affordable housing where the need exists. And that sums up the cases. So now we know that essentially you can't ignore the need for affordable housing in your communities. And I'm going to turn it over to Anurupa to talk about some of the land use tools that you can use in your community.
Thank you, Paula. So far, we have discussed the concept of affordable housing, a little bit of historical background, and some of the important benefits and challenges associated with it. as well as exclusionary zoning practices and some case laws related with it. Affordable housing is one of the policy areas which depend largely on all levels of government in terms of structural and institutional framework, that is, federal, state, and local governments. However, local governments also have an important role to play here, since the authority to regulate land use lies largely, if not exclusively, in the hands of local governments. They have some tools to facilitate the development of affordable housing, which is what we are going to discuss now. I'm sure many of you are aware of the basics of comprehensive plan, but I'll just go over a little bit about that and also contextualize the importance of affordable housing in the comprehensive plan. So a comprehensive plan is the foundation of the basic planning process of a community. It is the most important tool in land use planning. You can very well say it is a roadmap for development that prioritizes what kind of development should occur and where in the municipality, with both long-term and short-term goals in mind. Thus, a comprehensive plan provides a platform on which local laws, including affordable housing programs, are based upon. It therefore provides the rationale and the legal basis of any decisions or initiatives taken by the local government, especially if they are challenged in a court of law. In drafting your comprehensive plan, first, it is important to take into account the existing conditions, which can start with the study of your current demographic and the projected population dynamics based on the current trend and other factors which may influence your projected demographics. For instance, if you are seeing a surge in aging population in your community, then it is important to invest in senior housing developments which are affordable. In order to have more senior-friendly housing programs, it is important to understand the current housing inventory, the housing stock. Based on that, you can plan for the future. Therefore, examining the current housing stock and an assessment of the need for the future based on the community's goals and visions establishes the foundation for affordable housing in the comprehensive plan. We are going to deal with this issue of senior housing and its relation to affordable housing in more detail a little later. The study of existing conditions has to rely on valid sources of information and data. Some of the important ones are the U.S. Census, of course, the New York State Housing and Community Renewal Agency, the U.S. Housing and Urban Development Department, that's the HUD, and the local regional universities can also play an important role in providing some information on data. Then there are regional planning agencies and also nonprofit organizations in providing some important data based on which you can have a proper understanding of the current or the existing conditions. Here are two examples, one from Orange County and Southampton and Suffolk County, showing how affordable housing can be prioritized in the comprehensive plan. In both the instances, you will notice that the emphasis on choices, that is, choices for living in different geographical settings, such as rural, urban, or suburban, and also in terms of different styles of housing that will cater to a diverse population. That is for people who may come from different socioeconomic backgrounds, such as different classes or racial backgrounds, and also belonging to different age groups. If you see in the Orange County, I'll just read through it. It should encourage the provision of a wide spectrum of housing types and choices, including affordable housing, providing options for rural, suburban, and urban living. This should include housing at a range of densities, styles, and owner and renter types. So again, it's the emphasis on choices, which would cater to a wide or a diverse population. And the next one, the Southampton one, creation of planned residential communities providing an array of housing meeting the social and economic needs of the residents of the hamlets, the town, and the region. provide the opportunity for affordable housing for senior citizens aged 55 years and older. So one way to ensure housing choices for a diverse population is to have inclusionary housing policies, which is also sometimes called inclusionary zoning, as there might be the need to change zoning regulations before having inclusionary housing policies. One thing to keep in mind is inclusionary zoning needs to be seen in the local context. Its use and benefits may not for all communities. Therefore, it is important to tailor it to the need of the community or the goals of the community. As the name suggests, inclusionary housing is intended to be an antidote to exclusionary zoning practices. It aims at transferring some of the burden for developing and managing affordable housing from the public to the private sector. So what is inclusionary housing or zoning? It is basically the practice of requiring or encouraging the construction of affordable housing units. Now, this can be achieved in multiple ways. So in some instances, the developer reserves a part of or is required to reserve a part of the new development areas with market rate development or low poverty areas for units which are below the market rate. So in areas where a developer is going for development at the market price or have market price units, there they reserve a part of those housing units at below market rate so that low-income households or low-income families can afford them. Or the developer may also agree on creating affordable housing units in another site, not in those areas where they are doing a development for the market rate, but in a different area, which could be in some struggling neighborhoods to give a boost into those neighborhoods. Or they may also contribute, developers may also agree on contributing cash or land to a local housing trust fund or donate land to a municipal land bank, which can be used by the government to support affordable housing in other ways. That way, even though you may not be able to secure the affordable housing units immediately or in a particular development, but it may help in the future with other projects which can reap the benefits of the cash or land in building affordable housing units. A typical mandatory inclusionary regulation will specify the points mentioned in the slide here. This is important to indicate in your regulation as it takes away any guesswork or disagreements in the future. So these are good to have. So some of the important specifications which you need to put in the regulation is the size threshold of developments. So it can range from as few as 5 units to 30 units. So the development that is happening could be of as small as 5 units, or it could be 30 plus units. Also, it's important to specify the income range based on the goals that you have in mind for the tenants and the buyers, based on the area median income. So it could be from below 30% to as high as 130% of the area median income. So those affordable housing units will be accessible or would only be provided to the people whose income range falls in between 30% to 130% of the AMI. Also, the percentage of affordable units required to be set aside, that's also important. So this percentage kind of varies from as little as 5% to 25% or more in suburban areas, but most require about 15 to 20% of the units in the development to be affordable. But in a highly urbanized area, the set-aside number can be lower. You may also reduce this threshold if the units are set aside for very low-income households. So this number will depend on the goals that you have. So it will depend on the community's goals. If your goal is to provide housing for very low-income families in a particular area, since they are more disadvantaged, you may require a lower number of units to be set aside for affordable housing. The main objectives in creating affordable housing this way are to enable municipalities to leverage limited public resources. This also allows intermixing of different social and economic groups, facilitating social integration. Also, it has been noted that in various studies that better housing has a variety of positive health outcomes, as Paula noted earlier. Overall, you may say it is aimed at a greater good. However, the implementation of the policy will largely depend on the marketplace and the readiness of the developers of the community. That means the area in which the program is being designed for should have to be developmentally growing so that it can justify the establishment of a program like this. So if it's already in a very disadvantaged area, and if there is a pressure of mandatory inclusionary zoning, the developers might be kind of put off, may not be encouraged to go forward with that development. Also, the program itself should be executed in a way that development continues and is not stifled. That means the developers can comply with it without impairing the viability of the projects, which would kind of defeat the purpose of the program. So the main purpose of the program is to be able to encourage development as well as provide housing to a mix of people from different backgrounds, social and economic, and from different backgrounds, from age, including age and race. There are other aspects which you may consider putting in the regulations, because if you would like to work toward a goal by controlling the limited resources at your disposal, it is better if you specify them rather than keep them open, as specification implies planning, and planning ahead of time by taking proactive measures is always advisable than reacting to an out-of-hand situation. Here are some additional requirements to consider. The design and size standards. So ensure that the developers don't skimp on the size or the materials or the living space or the number of bedrooms or the number of bathrooms. So some developers may just want to do the bare minimum and not the due diligence in order to save money. For instance, they may only offer a studio or a one-bedroom apartment, but would not be the case with other market value apartments. There could be like 2 or 3 bedroom for the market value apartment, but for the affordable housing units, they may just skimp on the size. So see to it that the size and space options are similar to other units in the development. So the affordable units or housing units should look and feel as a part of the market rate units. It should not just stand out. It should blend well. Similarly, unit layout and location of the units are important considerations. Can the units be built apart from other units in the least desirable part of the site? So see to it that is not what is happening. As I just mentioned, that it should blend well with the market rate units. Because the main purpose of having it or having affordable housing is to be able to integrate the social integration is one of the primary motivation or the primary goal. So in order to do that, it's also important that physically the design and everything kind of blends well and kind of is fully integrated. But if you do not specify these aspects in the regulations, you may not be able to control them, and that will not bring out the desired results. It might not bring out the desired results. Also, the timeline is important. Will they be built along with the affordable units will be built along with the market rate units in one phase, or it will be kind of built later on? All of this are important, which needs to be specified ahead of time, and it should all be put in the regulations, because if not, there are chances of being shortchanged. Also ensure units remain affordable. That's an important consideration as well. So what does that mean? So affordability controls can range from none to permanent. Many times in the past, the controls were lifted off or rescinded after the lease was paid off in, say, about 30 or 40 years. Therefore, it is important to consider how long would you like to keep the units affordable. Also, make sure there is an ongoing management of the process after construction of the units. This is crucial because your goal is not just having affordable units at this moment or when the construction is done, but to ensure that there is continuation of the process in those units. So in terms of judging who qualifies for buying or renting property there, or even in maintenance operations, all would require a kind of continued oversight, continued supervision. So make sure you put all those requirements in the regulations. Municipalities may provide incentives to developers to create affordable housing units. So sometimes it's required and sometimes it can be encouraged through other means. And municipalities may provide incentives to developers to create affordable housing units. That is, the construction of affordable housing units may seem like, because most of the time or many times, the construction of affordable housing units may seem like additional cost burden on the developers. So in order to mitigate that, New York State requires municipalities to provide certain benefits to developers so that they are interested in complying with the local regulations. These incentives may include density bonuses, which is the most popular one. That means providing incentives to developers such as more intensive development for the land in question. So typically, programs allow increases between 10 to 20% over baseline permitted density in exchange for the provision of affordable housing. So for instance, if there is an X number of dwelling units are permitted in the land, you may allow more units in there with the exchange of more affordable housing units. Other possible benefits include greater than required open space or plans for public plaza or trails, or also rezoning the property such as from non-residential to residential. So all these incentives can go a long way in motivating or encouraging developers to comply with the local regulations of having affordable housing units in their developments. Or incentives can also be in the form of expedited permitting. That may be quite a motivation for developers who are wary of lengthy review process. So in the current context, time is money, and if the approval process can be expedited, then that saves money for the developer. So they might be interested to go for that, with giving in return affordable housing units. Public sector offsets play an important role in inclusionary housing programs. Offsets are actions or incentives that reduce the affordability gap in two ways. It helps in reducing the developer cost. For example, this can be done by waiving or reimbursing the application and development fees during the review process, or for that matter, the municipality may also allow the developer to charge a little higher price for the market units so that the so-called loss that the developer might face by having affordable housing units can be offset by some more profit, which he or she is able to do through the market units. So I've already talked about these incentives and offsets. This kind of gives a more detailed distinction between incentive and offsets, what kind of incentives can be given. As I said, that density bonuses, and there could also be some manipulation or regulation with regard to setbacks and height and bulk bonuses and open spaces. All of these kind of act as incentives for developers to be encouraged to have a development in that area, and in return also comply with the local regulation of providing an X number of affordable housing units. And offsets also, I've mentioned a few, and some of them could be other tax abatement and waiving of fees. As the name implies, if inclusionary zoning is done on a voluntary basis, it is not mandatory for developers to follow. Now the question arises, if it is not mandatory, then how to achieve or apply that? As I just talked about incentives, those can serve as the main way to encourage developers to create affordable housing. Now there are some pros and cons of inclusionary zoning done voluntarily. A clear advantage is it does not seem like a compulsion on the part of the developers to comply to. So there is a likelihood of less opposition. Also, some communities may have reservations on affordable housing units in their neighborhoods due to the flawed perceptions and myths of affordable housing, such as it can bring down the property values, or to more ominous ones, such as possibility of increased crime rate in the area. One way to resolve this is to inform and educate the community members of the importance of affordable housing so that they are more welcoming to have them in their community by understanding the importance and how it can cater to a large section of the community, of any community as such. In terms of cons, or in terms of the disadvantages, many studies across the country have shown that voluntary inclusionary zoning yields less successful results than mandatory ones. For instance, a 2003 study by California Coalition for Rural Housing and a nonprofit housing association of Northern California found that mandatory programs produce the most very low and low-income affordable units compared with voluntary programs, both in terms of absolute numbers and percentage of total development. Similar studies have been noted in Massachusetts and Washington, D.C. and other parts of the country. There is no hard and fast rules as to what and how to provide these incentives, as I have been talking about various options here. The level of incentives can be based on a sliding scale as well, so if that is what best suits your community's goals. As I've already mentioned, if the developer agrees on having a greater number of units devoted to lower to moderate income households, the level of incentives can be higher. So depending on what the community's goals are, you can actually have those regulations set. So it's very important to have it all set out in your comprehensive plan, because that kind of provides the basis or the foundation over which you can build on, and also have the affordable housing built into it, the regulations of affordable housing built into it with the goals, the community's goals in mind. Paula will now discuss more about workforce housing. Over to you, Paula.
Thanks so much, Anurupa. So we did inclusionary zoning, which is really difficult, I think, honestly, in most communities in New York to be able to pull off. So we do go through a lot of it, but I can't really point to any specific community that's really been knocking it out of the park in terms of inclusionary zoning. It relies on having to have like a really strong housing market, which I guess now, because we've seen a lot of regions go through a housing boom right now as people are moving out of New York City due to the COVID crisis. So maybe we could see more of those tools being implemented, but it's difficult, and it's hard to, I think it's a good point to just remind everyone that it's really hard to develop affordable housing. It just requires a lot of different moving parts to put together, and it's definitely a lot harder than some of the other housing that you can develop in your communities, and we'll talk some more about that. But for now, let's look at workforce housing. And workforce housing simply refers to housing that is affordable to the community's essential workers, such as teachers, police officers, firemen, nurses, medical personnel, and service workers. In the current times, these people play an incredibly important role in the health of our communities. Most of these people are essential, so they've been working through the pandemic from the beginning. So we see that we need home health care aides to live close to the populations they serve, especially if you have an aging population like many rural communities are experiencing. It's the same for our retail workers who've worked through the pandemic. They shouldn't have to, drive hours to get to work and be able to work in the community that they serve. So unfortunately, in a lot of communities, that doesn't really exist, and in some places that you wouldn't expect it. So definitions typically range from 50% to 120% of area median income and provides housing for families that contain at least one full-time worker that earns between minimum wage and the amount needed to live in the area, but they still can't afford to live near work. This is especially a big issue downstate in Long Island, Westchester, Rockland, Orange counties, Putnam as well, but it's also an issue in places, like I said before, about Lake Placid and the police officers, and other tourist communities, Saratoga, some of the Finger Lakes communities are really experiencing this, and places where short-term rentals have gobbled up the availability of housing. We've seen that in a lot of different places across New York State, where the locals can't afford to buy homes anymore because you have out-of-state and out-of-region people who are, buying real estate to essentially put it on VRBO or Airbnb. So it becomes unattainable to those who've grown up and are trying to stay in the region. And for workforce housing, it can refer to any form of housing. So it could be home ownership of single or multifamily housing. It could also be rental units. Essentially, if you're going to look at this, you should just look at what's needed in your community and then develop, of course, accordingly. The Long Island Workforce Housing Program, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because we're talking about the far west of our state, and Long Island is the polar opposite of where you guys are at. But essentially, this is just a program out there that applies to developers in those counties with applications to build 5 or more residential units. So the developers that choose to include the affordable units receive a density bonus for their projects. For those that don't, the program requires a payment of a fee for each affordable unit that the developer would have been required to build. And that fee is equal to 2 times the median income for a family of 4 on Long Island. So that's a significant amount of money. Unfortunately, though, I've read criticisms of the program itself that it's not as successful as they would have hoped. So this is something that, workforce housing and affordable housing in general is something that I think a lot of communities across the state in rural and suburban and urban places are really trying to grapple with. Another tool is cluster development, and that's just a zoning tool that allows units to be clustered closer together on a smaller section of property for the purpose of open space development. The density or the amount of units normally allowed by traditional zoning does not change. Instead, you're placing the units closer together. This can encourage the development of affordable housing because it minimizes the cost of infrastructure like roads, water lines, sewer, utilities, and sidewalks, which are all extremely expensive to place. And a savvy local government with a good cluster development law could add incentives, such as allowing developers to build bonus units in exchange for a number of affordable units. That would be kind of a way of using incentive zoning. This tool can be helpful in our rural communities, especially for hamlet development or revitalization, which we've seen in a lot of rural places across New York State over the past couple years. We also have accessory dwelling units, ADUs. They're a complete living space that's been built into the single-family home, sometimes known as an in-law apartment or a granny flat. They are affordable, allow intergenerational living arrangements because they provide proximity but maintain privacy. They preserve the single-family appearance of neighborhoods and are usually already served by municipal services and infrastructure. So you don't have to put anything especially into, you don't have to put any additional infrastructure in when you go down this route. If you have a lot of these in your community, your zoning may allow them as a right or by special use permit. They allow older people to stay in the community with family and has been a common form of housing for many years. It's also interesting because you can look at it as a way of recycling your housing, your existing housing stock, because if you have people moving into these, larger single family homes, if that senior was living by themselves in their own home that they had raised their children in, maybe as they age, it's not so safe for them to be alone in a big house, or they have too much space, they're looking to downsize. An ADU could be a really good opportunity in which to do that. And then that house that they were living in essentially can go onto the market for, a younger family that's looking for a new place. So it's kind of an interesting way of, so by encouraging this, you could be also encouraging more supply, especially if you live in a tight market. And again, a good use for those older, larger homes in our rural villages and hamlets. Sometimes some of these larger houses can be considered what we call middle housing, which is like 1 to 4 units between the bigger multifamily developments in larger communities. So for you guys, that might be, Jamestown. And it offers, more units that blend in nicely with the existing neighborhood fabric. So that is middle housing, which is a little different than EDUs because those are built into the house, but it's another tool that could be considered, especially when you look at what kind of housing supply is in your community, especially if you had an older community where you had a lot of older, larger homes that are difficult to uphold and maintain. And now we're going to look at manufactured housing. And manufactured housing is America's largest single source of unsubsidized affordable home ownership in the country. It is the de facto source of affordable housing in many of the nation's most persistent poverty regions and high-cost housing markets. There are about 1 in every 18 Americans live in manufactured housing. So 1 in 18 is a significant amount of our population. Manufactured housing units are freestanding and built on permanent foundations. It's also an estimate that they are 20 to 30% less expensive than a stick-built home. And unlike apartments, these units generally provide the privacy and amenities associated with conventional home ownership. So the 3 levels of regulation are federal, state, and local. And we'll start with the Federal Housing Act, Manufactured Housing Act of 1974. And that essentially Congress gave the Department of Housing and Urban Development the authority to develop a nationwide construction code to improve the quality and durability of manufactured housing. So manufactured homes manufactured after July 15th of 1976 must display a HUD seal or data plate to verify proper construction. Municipalities may regulate mobile homes without a data plate from before 1976, differently than those with the HUD plate. However, if a pre-1976 home can pass the structural, electrical, and other required inspections, it must be allowed wherever similarly sized HUD-certified homes are allowed. You would think that, especially in the Northeast, we wouldn't see so much of that, but every once in a while we do hear from a code official from across New York State about a person who's trying to move an old mobile home to a new place, which, as long as they can keep up with the codes, you wouldn't think from 1976, because that's a really long time ago, but you can allow it, which is interesting. So the second level of regulation is New York State regulation. So that's the New York State Uniform Fire Prevention and Building Code. And that provides that manufactured homes are constructed and installed in accordance with regulations adopted by the federal government. The most prevalent code problem encountered by manufactured homeowners is improper installation. And to combat this problem, our codes division recommends that the municipal code enforcement officer should perform 3 inspections when a manufactured home will be placed on a lot. First, the site should be inspected prior to installation to ensure that it was properly prepared. Secondly, during installation, the code officer should check the manufacturer's manual against the peer locations. And finally, after installation, the code officer should check to make sure the electrical and plumbing connections were properly made. And finally, the third level of regulation is the local level, where local governments can regulate location, lot size, and setbacks. However, outright prohibition of manufactured housing, again, is illegal in New York State. In fact, the state legislature found that there was a lot of discrimination against manufactured housing. So in 2015, New York executive law was changed, and it states that a manufactured home that is affixed to a permanent foundation and conforms with the identical development specification and standards, including general aesthetics and architectural standards, applicable to conventional site-built single-family dwellings in a residential district in which the manufactured home is to be sited, shall be deemed to be a conforming single-family dwelling for the purposes of applicable local zoning law or ordinance. This essentially means that a manufactured home shall be treated the same way in zoning as a single-family stick-built house. Our manufactured housing specialist in our codes division has to have this conversation with code enforcement officers and zoning enforcement officers all over the state all the time. Essentially, because of this law, you cannot discriminate against this type of housing in your community, and you have to allow for it in your community as well. You can regulate the aesthetics, but you can't regulate anything that covers the code requirements for it. And of course, we always see manufactured home parks. So there's a state oversight of manufactured home parks under the Manufactured Home Tenants Bill of Rights. The New York State Homes and Community Renewal is authorized to enforce the major provisions of Section 233 of real property law. And this law was passed partially because of a disparity in the position between lot owners and tenants when disputes or unfairness occurred. So local governments may not regulate within the areas encompassed by the Mobile Home Owners Bill of Rights because the state of New York has preempted this. However, the Attorney General essentially suggested that local governments can still require manufactured home parks to undergo site plan review. Local governments can also regulate other types of or other aspects of manufactured homes, so the location, lot size, setback, vehicle parking, aesthetics, and architectural standards, but just make sure that you're not openly discriminating against this type of housing, and make sure that you are allowing it somewhere in your community. Can't stress that one enough, especially that executive law. A lot of people are unaware of that, and that includes code officers and local officials as well. So it's just really important to keep in mind that they are considered single-family dwellings now. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Anurupa to talk a little bit about senior housing needs.
Thanks, Paula. Building affordable housing for seniors is far less controversial than general affordable housing, mainly because of the stigma associated with affordable housing units and the people for whom those are meant to be. So even though it's very much based on perceptions, but that is how it is, unfortunately. Just to give you some statistics here, about 17% of the total population in the country is 65 years or above. This figure is estimated to rise to 22% by 2050. So you see it's a significant part of the total population, the senior population. In the state of New York, over the past decade, the number of New Yorkers ages 65 and over increased by 26%. During the same period, the state's overall population grew by just 3%. So you see the seniors are the fastest growing age group in the state. As New York's older adult population grows, the number living in poverty has also increased. The number of older adults in poverty increased by 11%. So therefore, planning for such a large and growing population should be a priority, not only because of the rising numbers, but also because that is the right thing to do from a community standpoint. According to a 2010 American Association of Retired Persons, or the AARP survey, nearly 90% of those over the age of 65 want to stay in their residence for as long as possible. The senior population is mostly on a fixed or limited income, who often have difficulty finding affordable housing. Thus, providing housing for low-income seniors presents a particular challenge. In many cases, seniors draw limited amounts from Social Security and possible pensions, and for those who do not have sufficient savings, the cost of housing can be difficult to maintain. Even before the national financial crisis, many seniors had experienced difficulties staying in the homes they owned and occupied for decades due to various reasons. The rising costs associated with property taxes, also the rising energy costs. And then you have the accessibility issue. So accessibility is a big concern for the elderly population. Even in your own homes, which may have been fine or conducive earlier, due to lack of accessible designs, may not be appropriate when you grow older, such as staircases, which may not be very convenient anymore. Then routine maintenance and repairs may be demanding, both in terms of finances and time and effort, which can be cumbersome for the seniors. Therefore, housing options for the elderly population, keeping in mind the challenges and constraints, are important. Affordable housing can come in all shapes and sizes, and it can be a high-rise or accessory units, as you see in the particular slide I had also mentioned earlier. I'll just mention which from where these pictures or images have been taken. The bottom middle one is the Elder Cottage housing units in Tompkins County. The top left is in Brookside and West Sand Lake Senior Housing, and the right one is the O'Neill Apartments for seniors in Troy, New York. Senior Citizen Housing District, or they are known in different names such as Retirement Community District or Age-Restricted Cluster Housing or Planned Adult Community, or even planned retirement congregate housing communities, are becoming more common in municipalities that are addressing the need for this type of housing through zoning. There are additional tools for adding greater flexibility to zoning laws in the hands of local governments, such as overlay district, which establishes regulations to achieve a specific public purpose, such as senior housing. The overlay is usually applied over conventional zoning districts for areas that require special attention, such as an environmentally sensitive area or a rapidly developing strip corridor. Additionally, a floating zone is a zoning district that delineates conditions which must be met before that zoning district can be approved for an existing piece of land. Rather than being placed on the zoning map as traditional zones are, the floating zone is simply written as an amendment in the zoning ordinance. Thus, the zone floats until a development application is approved. Then the zone is added to the official zoning map. Floating zones can be used to plan for future land uses that are anticipated or desired by the community, but are not confirmed yet, such as senior affordable housing. As a side note, floating zones are not considered specifically in the enabling statutes, but are considered lawful within the general statutory grants of zoning power. Okay, so we are all aware of the SEQR, the State Environmental Quality Review process, even though it's a little daunting, but I will not be going overall because this is not the place for it. We have a separate course for the SEQR. There we talk a lot in detail about this process. Here I'll just specify the importance of affordable housing in SEQR. So since 2013, this affordable housing has been included in this the full environment assessment form. Here it mentions the proposed actions may displace affordable or low-income housing in an area where there is a shortage of such housing. So this mentions here the part which is on the slide marked in red. It mentions this. Therefore, the focus is not just on physical environment, but the social environment too, where it is important to analyze what kind of social and physical environment the project is producing or affecting. So in that way, the SEQR includes a question on affordable housing in the recent form. The risk of a proposed project of displacing affordable and low-income housing is higher in an area where there is already a shortage of such housing. Now, displacement could mean the housing structures are physically removed and replaced with other uses, or housing that is no longer affordable for the low-income families. Or displacement may also be in terms of redevelopment or rehabilitation, leading to gentrification of the area, resulting in higher rents and property values, which in turn lead to indirect displacement of the low-income families. There could be a lot which can be said on the dynamics of displacement and its negative impacts, but in short, I will just mention that displacement of this order can disrupt and change the social fabric, including the demographics of a community, which produces an exclusionary physical and social landscape. As we have been highlighting here, this is not really desirable. In terms of planning for affordable housing, as I have mentioned earlier, you have to start from the basics by gathering current data, as that provides a foundation on which you can build on further. Some important sources of housing data are your local government housing boards, commonly referred to as housing offices, which can help assess the local and regional housing needs. It is also a great resource for coordinating funding for the housing projects, or even help formulate policies and programs that will help planning for affordable housing units. Also, the regional planning commissions are rich sources of data and can go a long way in planning for affordable housing in your communities. The New York State's Homes and Community Renewal Agency is aimed at building and preserving affordable housing along with overall economic development and strengthening communities in the process. This is more of an informational slide, and I will just go over the main focus areas and the subgroups that the agency deals with. Although it is one agency, it is more of an umbrella organization focusing on other areas but related areas. The financial division looks after all the programs that fund the development of affordable housing, including low-income housing tax credit programs. The housing preservation aspect includes all the programs that maintain and enhance the state's existing affordable housing. This includes the Office of Rent Administration. Community renewal part under the HCR includes all the programs geared toward community and economic development, job creation and downtown revitalization, including the New York State Community Development Block Grant Program, the New York Main Street Program, Affordable Housing Corporation, Neighborhood Stabilization Program, and the Neighborhood and Rural Preservation Programs. There is also the State of New York Mortgage Agency, which is also called Sonny Mae. It offers 5 mortgage programs to assist first-time home buyers with the purchase of a home in New York State. The 5 mortgage programs feature competitive interest rates, low down payment requirements, even down payment assistance is provided, and also they provide flexible underwriting guidelines. Now, these features are all supposed to make your home purchase more affordable. So these are some of the programs or assistance that you may say are available for affordable housing home buyers. Paula will now go over the process of building affordable housing in more detail.
Great. So I think the next point is just to kind of bring you through the process and what developers and nonprofits are thinking about when they find places in which to try to build some affordable housing. And I think that's just important for you as local officials making land use decisions on these developments to also be aware of, especially when they come before your boards. So here's a typical flow chart of the process. You start up in that yellow box on the left where you have a project concept. Sometimes you have to raise pre-development funds. Usually at the same time, you're looking at your development team. So if you're a nonprofit, typically you have these people on staff, or maybe you have a partnership with other organizations, especially in these tight fiscal times. You might be working with different groups to pool your resources together to make it a team effort. Then you want to evaluate, one, the site that you're looking at, as well as any alternative sites, because unfortunately in some communities, opposition might stop development in its tracks. We especially see this with supportive housing in a lot of communities. With the opioid epidemic, we do need a lot of supportive housing for people who struggle with addiction, and that usually brings, unfortunately, a lot of people out in opposition to it. So once you acquire control of the site in which you're going to develop, you prepare your preliminary design and site plan for land use approval. That's where you as board members get involved. At the same time, the sponsor is usually exploring their financing options and applying for financing and grant funds. And at the same time, they're going through the land use approvals process and preparing their final plans and designs. And of course, they have to bid the project and hope that they have enough money to cover the costs. And unfortunately, a lot of times they can be stopped by litigation as well. So that's another cost that sometimes will, hinder the development of some of these projects. I usually hire a contractor or a team to overlook the construction. You start construction, and essentially you're trying to close on your financing all at the same time. The process usually takes about 2 years. Sometimes it's more. I've worked with a nonprofit on Long Island that I think it's a 12-year process at this point, just because they've been, it's one issue and one litigation case after another, unfortunately. But usually you have a pretty good team of people who are doing it. You guys in Western New York have probably more rural preservation companies, but I believe there's a neighborhood preservation company in Jamestown as well. So there are nonprofits in your communities that are working on these issues and trying to do the best they can in these weird fiscal times. And some of the principal site selection essentially begins with finding an available appropriate site. And then you decide as a developer if the site meets all of your criteria. So for zoning, you look at, use, height, setbacks, the local regulations that everybody has to play by. You want to make sure, is it consistent? If not, are you going to need a variance of some kind or maybe a special use permit, because that can slow down the process. You want the unit mix, size mix. It's, a mix of housing sizes for various groups. So maybe single family, parent families, large families, seniors that are raising their grandchildren. That's a big, we've seen a lot of work in that with that population over the past couple of years, people with disabilities. And what's adequate, ideal? Are you going to incorporate universal design features? Are you going to do a combination of unit sizes to really impact the project on the ground? And then infrastructure, so of course that's all your sewer, roads, water. Is it available? If not, can it be brought in or provided on site? Your environmental constraints, you don't want to see anybody developing in a floodplain or a wetland or on steep slopes. If you can it be adequately mitigated? But essentially, really, if in an environmentally sensitive area, you should just avoid development at all costs anyway, because it's the best way to deal with that. Is there access to public transportation, job services, and recreation? You don't want to strand people when you, develop these places, put them out in the middle of nowhere. If they don't have a car and they can't get around, it's not really good for anybody. So can you improve it or provide services on site? A lot of transit authorities will partner with developers to provide services to people, so that's always good. Compatibility with surrounding uses, you want to make sure that it's not incompatible, or if you can change it through, design or other means. A lot of time, especially those 1 to 4 units, really can be used to kind of hit that middle gap between doing a really large, multifamily project. They blend in better. It's a good use of buildings that are already there. And then, of course, is there any special considerations or constraints? So is it in a historic district? Is it on an agricultural active land, farmland? Is there any easements they have to deal with? Are you looking to your regional plans to see what kind of housing is really needed? Is there any specific funding program criteria or requirements that, the developer needs to go by? And if yes, can it be addressed in ways that protect both? So these are just some questions that, developers think about before they come before your boards, but it's good for you to also think about how, where these projects come from. And of course, there are some design considerations as well. So again, site selection, making sure that it's near jobs and services. Don't strand people in a place with no services. We hate to see when senior housing is built in, a more rural place, and your comprehensive plan says that you're a community that enjoys walkability, and then the site plan itself has no sidewalks. You're essentially then just stranding these people, in a place that they can't get out and walk around. In high school, I used to work for a senior living community, and it was on the outskirts of town. There was no sidewalks, and honestly, I felt really bad for a lot of the more active residents because they essentially felt like they were disconnected from the world. They had to rely on a service to come take them out that you had to book well in advance. So if you're a community with an active, senior community and you're looking at doing one of these, make sure it's close to town. Do it in your hamlet so that, if they need to go and get, a medicine or they need to pick up a carton of milk, it's not difficult for them to do it without having to drive. And design, again, for that target group. So are you looking, is it a problem with, senior housing, or maybe it's working families that you're trying to do it to provide housing for? Is it your workforce housing or immigrants? We see a lot of immigrants in a lot of communities across upstate New York. And of course, it most of the time comes down to economics. What can you afford to build? So the income ranges is a percentage of AMI. Like I said at the beginning of this, 30% and 50% AMI are the hardest. They're the hardest housing to provide for because it means you have to have more funding to offset the high costs of construction and also the the maintenance costs after it's built over time. And of course, some of the types of housing, are you looking at apartments, so low rise or high rise? Try to make it, of course, match your community character. In a lot of rural places, we see old school buildings being transitioned over to Section 238 housing, which is senior housing, because those are places that often can be retrofitted a little bit easier for elevators and whatnot, so seniors don't have to deal with the stairs. You could also do garden-style apartments or townhomes. It depends, of course, you go back to what the need is, because a developer is not going to come to your community to develop something that there's no need for. And then, of course, remember, affordable housing also includes, single family or small multi-family. So you want to look at size and is it the same location or scattered? Sometimes this is a good use of vacant homes in your community if you're having a real difficulty from zombie homes after the recession in 2008. What do they look like? The design, are they traditional or maybe condos? There's risk and rewards, of course, in everything. But we like to see a lot of rehab of older buildings because preservation, the greenest project, is keeping what you already have instead of breaking new ground. And preservation is a critical issue with two important aspects. You want to keep yourselves from losing the affordable housing that already has been built in your community, and try to make sure that future affordable housing remains affordable to the next generation. Again, we looked at the loss of the supply of affordable rental housing over time, both subsidized and unsubsidized. It's a shrinking supply, while demand is, of course, always on the rise, especially now as we're looking at, a pretty unstable economy again. So you can look at, there's also economic and social benefits, but communities can look to spatial mapping programs like GIS, and that can help policymakers get more of a comprehensive view of the area's affordable housing stock to better target and track those preservation efforts. And in general, let's just keep in mind that housing is exceptionally durable. Houses built hundreds of years ago are still in use throughout the world, especially when you travel to Europe and take a look at that. 70% of American homes and apartments were built before 1960s. But again, it's that maintenance is important. So if you have a properly repaired and maintained home, most housing units could still be functional and going strong decades from now. And there's also a complication when it comes to preserving affordable housing as affordable housing, which Anurupa briefly touched on. Again, before the 1960s, the federal government was more directly involved in the creation of affordable housing. So public housing was developed and also owned by public entities. But since then, subsidized housing has mostly been built by private entities. For most cases, that's for-profit developers. So instead of the government paying the cost of the projects through grants, nearly 1.5 million units in new projects under both Section 236 and Section 8 were financed with a combination of subsidy contracts and mortgages written for terms varying from 20 to 40 years. And the problem with that is once the mortgage is paid off, the use restrictions on the property, like the deed restrictions, expire, and the owner's obligation to maintain the development as affordable housing is at an end. So we've seen a lot of these buildings, they hit the end of that 40 years, and they're free to reset rents to market rates, or just convert the development to condos. We've seen it all over New York State. It's unfortunate. So since the late 80s, the potential loss of well over 1 million existing affordable rental units created under Section 236 and Section 8. So that's really bad news because we see a lot of those units over time eventually get taken off the tax roll or get taken off the affordable housing list. So that's always really, really difficult. And now we'll just briefly look at the future. Of course, gentrification is a problem, and economic vitality really goes hand in hand with affordable housing. So some of the trends that we're seeing that is affecting housing is, again, that supply is shrinking while the demand is increasing, especially as people are losing their jobs in this pandemic. We also have an aging population that might not be able to age safely at home, so we want to make sure that those people are living in a place where it's safe for them as they age. And then we're seeing movement back to the city and along urban waterfronts. We're also seeing a lot of hamlet revitalization, which is always a good thing. But unfortunately, many urban areas are located in 100-year floodplains, and low-income people are hit harder by natural disasters, and they also take longer to bounce back. We've seen that in Houston after hurricanes. We've seen that in New Orleans. We've seen it all over the country. We saw it after Superstorm Sandy as well. So we want to make sure that we're not, overly developing in places where it's environmentally sensitive. And job types and locations may change. We know this even more so now in COVID-19. We're seeing a shift in how we work. A lot of us are working from home for a long time now. We've been home at the Department of State since March, which is crazy. I haven't seen any of my colleagues. I haven't met Anurupa in person because she came on after, which is crazy. And economic trends, there's land scarcity in our most desirable locations in urban areas. So of course, the price of land typically only goes up. In some parts of the state, it's going up even more so in these COVID times because people are trying to leave more dense built-out places like New York City. Especially now when people can also work from home, it doesn't really matter where they live because they don't have to get to their job physically. There's complex government funding programs that are subject to change, or they get defunded altogether, unfortunately. We've seen some of that. Regulations, of course, can slow the development process, as well as just NIMBYism. People can come out and be really, upset about a project, and it can really bring the whole process to a halt. There's, of course, energy concerns. The governor has a very ambitious plan to get us to net zero electric by 2050. So that's going to have a big impact on all communities. There's a greater economic divide. A good point in this one is a lot of millennials, people think that they don't want to buy their own homes, but many of them really do want a piece of the American dream, but they're too strapped with student debt and they're paying a lot more in rent, so they can't, save for a house, save for that down payment. The economy is slow to recover. Again, we went through a huge foreclosure crisis after 2008, and unfortunately, we may be looking at another recession as we're still trying to dig out from 2008. We have an aging housing stock, which isn't normally, an issue, but it means that older homes tend to have, issues where you need to keep up with them, and the maintenance issues can become a problem. And also a lot of times, we have a lot of, vacant and zombie homes around your communities as well. So it's sometimes hard to get those properties back on the tax roll. And again, those, there's stress from, which is funny, it's not on that, but it's on my handout. There's stress from short-term rentals in a lot of communities. So The rise of Airbnbs have taken regular apartments away from full-time residents and pricing them out. We've seen that around the country. And durational stipulations on some housing. Again, after the developer has done their 40-year, 20 to 40-year stint with affordable units, they can essentially send them back to the market rent. So, and that can be problematic for people who had been living there. And of course, we would be remiss if we didn't discuss COVID-19 and its impact on housing. So on March 20th, the governor enacted Executive Order 202.8, which placed a moratorium on residential and commercial evictions to ensure no tenant was evicted during the height of the public health emergency. The governor then signed the Tenant Safe Harbor Act on June 30th, which lengthened the eviction moratorium and provided financial assistance to residential renters and landlords. It essentially allowed people to apply for some funding to get them up to date on their rent. It went specifically to landlords. I would have included it, but the application is now closed. And we have eviction protections were again extended this week to cover residential renters until January 1st, 2021. And essentially, the protections include prohibiting charges or fees for late rent payments. Tenants facing financial hardship like job loss can use their security deposit as payment and then repay their security deposit over time with no penalties. And there is no moratorium on a tenant's obligation to pay rent or an owner's obligation to provide essential services. So if the heat breaks, the landlord still has to fix it. The tenant still has to pay their rent. They just might be doing it on a little bit of a modified schedule. And on the commercial side, just yesterday, October 20th, we saw Executive Order 202.70, which suspends eviction of any commercial tenant for non-payment of rent until the 1st of January in 2021. And again, this was something that just extended the protections already in place for commercial tenants because we realized that there's been a financial toll the pandemic has taken on business owners, including and especially retail and restaurants. And it gives commercial tenants additional time to get back on their feet and catch up on rent or to renegotiate their lease terms to avoid eviction after that date. And of course, this is something that also is important for homeowners. Federal and state law allows homeowners to enter into forbearance if they're experiencing a COVID-related hardship like job loss or income loss. Federally backed and non-federal mortgages allows those deferment of payments for up to a year. The stipulations are a little different depending on loan product, but the New York State Attorney General has a really good website for guidance for people who are experiencing hardship. There's currently no negative reporting to credit bureaus. There's a grace period for loan modification. And this is really important to keep in mind because banks don't want to foreclose on owners. So this gives, owners an opportunity to renegotiate those missed payments and modify those loans because currently the way it was set up that you miss a couple of payments and when you're after forbearance, you go back and pay all of that up front. But if you lost your job, most likely you can't afford to do that lump sum after you get back on your feet. So if you modify your loan, it allows you a little bit more flexibility in terms of getting back on your feet. So that's really important. And any foreclosure proceedings must include a notice indicating the defendant may be eligible for an extension of time to respond. So they're not trying to see people through foreclosure anytime soon. We're a judicial foreclosure state anyway, so it takes a long time to get through that process. So again, the banks are in the process of trying to kick people out, although we did see some abuses back in 2008. But there are plenty of legal aid resources out there for struggling homeowners, so I really encourage you to take advantage of those services out there. And in a couple of slides, I left some resources in there for people to turn to. And essentially, that same executive order for our commercial owners applies like it does to tenants. So it suspends foreclosure for any commercial owner for mortgage non-payment until the 1st of next year. And that already extends, again, the protections already in place for commercial owners. And it gives them additional time to get back on their feet and renegotiate those mortgage loan loan terms to avoid foreclosure, because we don't want to see people getting kicked out of their of their homes and their livelihoods. And finally, our conclusion. So like we said, over the course of the past hour or 2 hours, like, affordable housing is just a really difficult topic in many communities. You want to address your housing needs in your comprehensive plan. If you're not meeting them now, take a look at your comprehensive plan. So if you don't have a ton of work happening before you, being a planning board member, you can always look at what the issues are in your community. So if you haven't done a housing study in a long time, you can always do that. Encourage inclusionary housing policies. Most likely the people who would qualify for affordable housing in your community are residents of your community. There's always this fear of people coming from other places is really often false. A lot of times if it's like senior housing, it's going to be, housing the seniors in your own community. Promote workforce housing. Again, we don't want to see nurses and doctors and cashiers having to go a long distance to get to your community to offer those services. Use those land use tools to attain your goals. And, housing integration is key. We need a mix of types, age, rental, and owner-occupied housing, multifamily and single family, even in your, more rural communities across New York State. Foster the regional equality. Don't plan in a vacuum. Pay attention to your whole region. Sometimes it's good just to pick up the phone, talk to somebody at Southern Tier West and see what, if you're in, Allegheny County, see what they're doing in Chautauqua County. And of course, educate public officials and constituency. It's the best way to counteract opposition. Work and support your nonprofit housing providers. They provide such crucial services in your community. If you don't know who they are, introduce yourself. A lot of times it makes all the difference in the world for them to get, some help in terms of the work that they do as well. And finally, just some resources. That's HUD, if you need to reach out to them, and New York Homes and Community Renewal. These are all the COVID-19 resources that I was talking about. The New York State Attorney General coronavirus resources have really good resources for both homeowners and tenants if you're having, or somebody who's having a problem. The Homeowner Protection Program hotline, that's for homeowners that are looking at foreclosure. And there's some COVID-19 frequently asked questions on the HCR website as well. And some resources for manufactured housing. There's a help hotline at HCR. I forgot that our publication on manufactured housing, I didn't include a link, but if you're interested in that, please, you can go to our website and find it in the James A. Kuhn technical series, but also you can always reach out to us by email. We'd be happy to send it over. There's also the Livable New York Resource Manual that's available online at the Office of the Aging. These are some housing agencies and organizations across New York that work in the field. They could be useful for data as well as assistance in connecting, networking. And finally, of course, this is how to get in touch with us. The easiest way, because of the pandemic, is by email. So never hesitate to send us an email if issues are happening. And, I just realized it's after 4. I'm so sorry. We've run a little over. So we'd be happy to take a couple of questions if you'd like. If you don't, you can always reach out to us by email. We'd be happy to help. And of course, as always, we appreciate all of you that have joined us for training this afternoon. It's always so incredibly important. We're always happy to provide this to communities. I see I have one question here. Can affordable housing rental rates be higher than market rates in surrounding neighborhoods? I guess technically they could be. Typically they're not, though, in most communities. It depends on what type of affordable housing, like if you have a Section 8 voucher, that's kind of stipulated there. It doesn't tend to be higher, but in some more, I guess, difficult areas, that can be the case. Otherwise, I don't see any other questions. Is there anything you want to add before we end, Anurupa? Or Trish?
No.
All
No,
right.
I'm good.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you again for joining us this afternoon. We really appreciate it. Always feel free to get in touch about affordable housing or any other land use issue that's coming before or is an issue in your community. And of course, we like to thank you again for joining us, and please continue to be safe and well. Thanks.
Thank you.
Have
Bye.
a good afternoon.